That's Debatable is sponsored by MB&G. MB&G are specialists in the esoteric world of vehicle and furniture warranty insurance, delivering quite marvellous customer service, prompt claims payment, and a highly developed understanding of how to deliver these products in a way that is both compliant with the regulations and attractive to customers. To find out more, call Paul Smith, the Managing Director, on 07887 501 441. That's 07887 501 441. Welcome to That's Debatable, the weekly news podcast of the Free Speech Union. Welcome back to all of our listeners and all of our viewers, and welcome back to you as well, Jan. You were at the Charlie Hebdo protest, or memorial rather, the vigil, last week. How did it go?
Yes, so this was last Tuesday. A group called Our Fight decided that there should be some kind of commemoration for the 10-year anniversary of the massacre of the Charlie Hebdo writers, cartoonists, plus those who were also caught up and also murdered on that day. So, and Free Speech Union, we were very happy to be part of that as well. There wasn't an awful lot else going on, I have to say, which was really tragic, actually. But nevertheless, there was about 30 of us got together in Trafalgar Square at 10:30 in the morning, which was just half an hour before the actual time point when the massacre happened. And we had speeches. So I gave a speech. Jonathan Sashadotti, who's a Jewish journalist, who was the chap. Actually, if people looked at what was going on at the Oxford Union before Christmas, when there was that huge furore about the Oxford Union debate on Israel-Palestine, Jonathan was the first speaker on the Israel side and gave accounts of that afterwards. So he spoke. Felice Baspol, who's a Danish student studying in Ireland, and she spoke because originally the cartoons controversy began in Denmark. And so she spoke about how, for people of her generation, I think she's 22, the Charlie Hebdo massacre was a really formative experience. And she said it was one of the first political experiences that she kind of remembers having. So she spoke very eloquently. But what was really amazing was we had these speeches, and there was a few of us, but not many. We were having pictures taken, and we all had Je suis Charlie little placards. And we stood on the steps just below the National Gallery in Trafalgar Square to take a photograph. And across the square, we saw a bunch of about 20 odd young people who were taking photographs of us and waving. And somebody shouted out saying, "Are you French? Are you French?" And they said, "Oui." And they came
Which
running
is yes,
over.
by the way.
Yes, they came running over. They were probably 17, 18-year-olds, probably sixth form level. And they came running to our group, grabbed the Je suis Charlie placards and joined us on the front row. So there's a lovely photograph of all the people that were there already, and then an additional 20 young people who just spontaneously knew what Je suis Charlie meant and which side they were on.
Fantastic.
And that was so, it was so encouraging. Honestly, we were all very kind of moved by it. Choked because there weren't very many young people there other than Felice there to start with. And then suddenly our numbers almost doubled by these kind of youngsters who, two of whom lived were at primary school on the street where the Charlie Hebdo offices were. And so they knew exactly what had gone on. And, precariously close, given that a policeman was shot dead by the terrorists just down the road. So they would have been locked down at the time. So it was, and not only that, the others had all been taught at school the correct lessons from Charlie Hebdo, which is that you must stand up for freedom of speech. So they just knew, the kind of instinct was there. It wasn't controversial for them to come and hold a Je suis Charlie placard. So that was brilliant. I mean, I've said, my God, this is serendipitous. And then Josh Howie, the GB News presenter, who was also there, said, "That's not luck, that's God."
There you go. You had a believer amongst you.
That's what his interpretation. So yeah, I also wanted to give a quick plug actually for, there's a long spiked online interview, 30 minutes long, with the current editor-in-chief of Charlie Hebdo, Gerard Briard, I think his name is, or Biard. And it's such a fascinating interview because he deals with the run-up, the long run up to the eventual massacre. So going all the way back to 2005 and the cartoons controversy and the origins of that, which is a much more complicated story than a lot of people probably think. So it's really, really worth listening to. That's one of their specialist podcasts. So yeah, that was eye-opening for me actually to hear him
We'll also put a
interviewed.
link in the show notes to your speech that you gave in Trafalgar Square, which I found quite moving. I thought it was a magnificent. It's not a long speech you made, Jan, but it was very heartfelt. It was clearly very heartfelt, and I think we twittered it out that later that week. So we'll put a link into that. But I'm so pleased that vigil ended up with that heartening outcome where French school kids, or French students rather, saw immediately what it was about and understood immediately what the issues at stake were. Says a lot about how culturally France is a lot clearer, perhaps, on how important free speech is, and
Yeah.
hasn't lost it to the extent that we've kind of just thrown it into the memory hole here in the
Mm.
Anglosphere.
Mm.
Should we move on then to our first main item for today, which is a specific case? It's the specific case that a number of our readers, watchers, viewers will be already very aware of. It's that of Saba Poursaeedi. Now, Saba is a housing officer, or he was a housing officer, but he was sacked for being a Reform UK candidate. And also, he was sacked for reposting a Matt cartoon from the Telegraph. Now, that's according to legal documents obtained by the Telegraph. Ironically enough, of course, Matt is an absolute national treasure. I mean, if you ever need cheering up over your boiled egg in the morning, turn to the Matt cartoon. He is, I think, a genius and absolutely a national treasure. He always puts a smile on your face, and he's very gentle in his humor, actually. And even this cartoon, I think, was quite a gentle ribbing of stuff that was going on at the time. So anyhow, Saba Poursaeedi, he's a father of two. He's now suing this housing association for political discrimination after he was allegedly fired over his links to Reform UK. Essentially, Jan, what I found quite depressingly predictable about this is that the Housing Association told him that Reform's policies on immigration, net zero, and housing were in direct conflict with its own values. It's called Hightown Housing Association. Now, I don't know when this started, Jan, although I have a sneaky feeling it's a lot to do with ESG and EDI. But the idea that institutions and organizations have a set of values as if they're a person, not a collection of people taking on different roles within that collective who may have totally different views on a range of different issues. Suddenly, institutions all over the place have values. And if you don't meet those values in their eyes, you end up with these absolutely terrible consequences, up to and including dismissal, being sacked, being fired. I don't know what you feel about that idea of a set of values leading to the loss of your job. I mean, on the flip side, of course, there is a code of conduct in a workplace. You can't bully people, you can't harass people, but that's nothing new. But expressing or even standing as a political candidate being enough to push someone over the brink, or liking a cartoon or sharing a cartoon that is in a national newspaper, to me is clearly beyond the bounds of what a workplace should be putting into its effective code of conduct or its book of values, whatever that means.
Mm. Well, I think it exposes they're not values at all, are they? I mean, net zero is not a value. I
Mm,
mean, what's the what's the moral value in which side you land on in the net zero debate? I mean, it's a technical question,
yeah.
really. I mean, it's obviously we can feel that it gets imbued with values, but almost retrospectively, I mean, it's really a question of what's your assessment of climate change and what do you think the solution is? I mean, there's no values in that of any worth. It's a policy question as far as I'm concerned. So whatever you think of that you can afford to have a variety of views on that in a workplace, surely. And then similarly, immigration, really, you could say that being racist or not racist is a value in some ways, but immigration as a question of how you deal with global flows of people and where they shouldn't be allowed to come in and what criteria should be applied to them, what should happen once they're here, all of that's really relatively a technical question, not a value. And I think that's very revealing, really, isn't it? That you have these sort of technical questions, which I suppose you could argue that a housing association might be required to deal with things that are very closely related to immigration and that policy. But that's policy. That's not values. It tells you nothing about Saba Poursaeedi's views on other people and on racism, that he may have a particular view about immigration controls, so which would be reflected in his candidacy for Reform UK. So we're in a right old mess, really, aren't we?
We
And
are,
I
and it
think we can
reminds
say
me
this
of
every week.
we did some research last year on carbon literacy training, which is propagating throughout the private sector and the public sector, all throughout all sorts of organisations across the UK, and becoming a carbon literate organisation. And some of the wording in that training that we analysed, and the report is available on our website, uh, essentially said, if you become a carbon literate citizen, a member of society, in some sense, that's good for society. There was a real value set behind getting people through this course so that would be good for society. And there was an intrusion as well, we felt, certainly, and indeed the member who raised or highlighted this training to us, there's an intrusion into people's personal lives, because it was very much the action points coming out of this training need to be, of course, things that you might do in the workplace, but also what are you doing at home? What are you doing in your community in order to become carbon neutral or net zero, whatever it is? So again, this idea of values, and it was the thing we were particularly worried about was that these goals, these objectives around carbon were being put into people's performance goals in order for that organization to become a carbon literate organization. So when you've got all of that background, of course, suddenly you can see why managers and executives start talking about the values of an organization when it comes to net zero. And that's just carbon. You've then got anti-racism and other things we'll come on to talk about in our next item. But yeah, it's that's a really helpful distinction, I think, you made there. This distinction between values and policies, and policies have now got this halo around them of, well, a good policy has a good set of values and a bad policy has a bad set of values. So it's become very warped as a result, but with such real life consequences. I mean, for someone
Mm.
who's not earning a lot at all, you think, goodness me, to lose that job. I think he's got kids. That's a family losing their means of getting by. So it has real life
Yeah, I think it.
consequences. But there is some good news in so much as the fundraiser, and I saw you drop this in the notes this morning, Jan. The fundraiser that we informed our members about just a couple of days ago is already up at nearly £19,000. So, with 24 days to go and a stretch target of £28,000, I think that's fantastic, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, I think there's so many of these cases, they just really resonate because anybody could be Saba. So many people realise that that's exactly what they fear in their workplaces, and of course, most people cannot afford to speak out.
Mm.
I mean, it's a brave thing to stand as a parliamentary candidate, and the idea that people would be discouraged from taking part in democracy. I think Toby made this point in a short video we've made, an interview with Saba that Toby's done, and he makes the point that what dreadful circumstances if people don't feel that they can become actively involved in a democratic process because of their workplace suppose the values of the workplace. I mean, what better values could you have than to have engaged citizens who want to engage in democracy and actually take responsibility for their local area? And that's a brilliant thing. Anybody who wants to do that is an asset, aren't they? And the idea that somehow you'd be able to turn that into a negative, I mean, it's really sad, really sad. And so but hopefully we'll be able to be in a very good position to push back on that.
Yeah, I mean, and we're very grateful to everyone who's already contributed. The fundraiser's up and live, and we'll keep on plugging that. It's another really important case for us to make the point that needs to be made, which is everyone should be allowed to get involved in politics and not have their job at risk. And it is, you're right. It is. People are just not going to put themselves forward. It's going to erode beyond what it already is. The openness and the honesty of the political square, and certainly it's going to narrow people's experience in the workplace. And
it's topsy-turvy, isn't it? Because Saba wants to get involved in civic life while having an income from his job that he will do well. So he wants separately to become involved in civic life. And the workplace is saying, no, you must, this is where politics happens. You must hold these political views in your workplace. And not only that, we want to discourage you from taking part independently in civic life. It's completely arse backwards. And it's a really, really important point, I think, this one. So it's a very good case. And I'm very hopeful we'll win.
Staying on a very similar theme, this idea of institutions having values, institutions being captured. The Royal College of Speech and Language Therapists was in the news this week. So the boss of that group, called Steve Jameson, has been forced to issue what can only, and this is in the Mail, and I think it can only be described as a groveling apology after a 5-month investigation, all because of what? Because he followed Tommy Robinson on X. He didn't like anything. He didn't repost any views of Tommy Robinson, but he still faced calls to resign from the Royal College of Speech and Language Therapists. Now, I'm no expert on X. You're on it, Jan. I'm on other platforms, but there's no doubt that I do not agree with everything that people I follow on Facebook or people I follow on Instagram. I do not agree with everything they think and say. And I wouldn't expect to agree with everything that they think or say. And I certainly, wouldn't repost things that I don't think or believe. And yet just following Tommy Robinson was enough for Steve Jameson to be put through the ringer. And when I say the ringer, so what happened? The Royal College of Speech and Language Therapists, the RCSLT, appointed a subcommittee which instructed a barrister to investigate the incident. It's likely that investigation would have cost thousands, if not tens of thousands of pounds. And that investigation ended recently, last week, and found that on the balance of probabilities, this was an accidental follow. But Mr. Jameson, Steve Jameson, was still required to publish a formal, as the Daily Mail calls it, a Mea Culpa. And this is the wording that he wrote. He said, "I'm deeply sorry for the hurt, upset, distress, fear, and anger that this caused members, colleagues, and staff. I'm deeply sorry for the hurt, upset, distress, fear, and anger that this caused members, colleagues, and staff." I mean, if something isn't a Maoist apology, Jan, just for following someone arguably unsavory on social media, then I don't know what is. I really despair that anyone would be forced to write that and to apologize with that kind of wording as to where we've got to.
Yeah, and I think it's a really interesting. I'd love somebody to write a kind of deconstruction of how each of these institutions does the worst possible thing, makes the worst possible judgments at a certain point. And I mean, people might use the term captured. It does look like that. So, but I think there's a complex interaction that goes on here. So I was looking at the kind of Twitter feeds of some of the people who very proudly took down or aimed to take down the chief exec of the Royal College, and it, what I think you can see happening here is that institutions are already moving relatively spontaneously, a bit like we talked about the housing association in the previous conversation. They're already moving in this direction themselves spontaneously, in terms of anti-racism, social justice, environmentalism, all the same kind of ideas just get pushed through. That's sort of just the way where everybody everywhere was heading. But then you get this additional factor. It's almost like an accelerant of small activist groups who will never be satisfied by any of those shifts. So you can have this kind of slower shift going on in the institutions that's very mainstream in some ways. It's very familiar to all of us, and we may or may not support them. But then you have this additional kind of force of activist groups. And in this case, it was 3 people who launched this campaign against Steve Jameson called the Anti-Racism Action Collective. They're on Twitter. You can sort of see, who they are, and they are. One of them is academic based. So although she's a speech and language therapist, she's an academic, and it's just post after post about the politics of primarily of race, but also everything else you might imagine. So it's about the trans issue and queer and Palestine versus Israel. You can predict which side people land, and there's like this kind of thread, and they will just keep pressuring the institutions to go further and further and further. And in order to do that, they need to kind of defenestrate the people, or decapitate maybe the people at the top of the institution who are probably overseeing the moderate moves, but won't go far enough for the activists. And they're the activists, they need to take those guys out. And that's what happens, although that's what the attempt is all the time. It's kind of interesting that these key points happen, like whether that was the George Floyd moment, the summer riots, clearly in this case, are the thing that an event happens way outside of the institution. The institution and the activists kind of say, well, we need to say something about the riots. We need to reassure Muslim people who are therapists or who will receive speech and language therapy. We need to make sure we're allies for the people that we perceive are the kind of victims of this situation. And then, so the people are saying things like, these therapists, radical therapists, are saying, why aren't young therapists and young professionals saying more about the riots? They're disturbingly silent. And so they're kind of forcing everybody to have a view on an incident that you don't know what your take is to start with. It's very difficult to understand what was going on in the riots in the summer. It was very complicated. So to demand that everybody, including the institution, has a hot take, is really, really destructive. And you can see that what there happens is that people have to fall on their swords, because he might have been trying to work it out as well, Steve Jameson, by following Tommy Robinson, if he meant to or not, trying to work out what the hell was going on.
It also reminds me of what Douglas Murray says in his book, The War on the West, which is that the way that activism works is that just as the train is pulling into the station of, yes, we've got the rights, we've got the recognition, whether it's race, whether it's sexuality, whether it's any of the other hot button topics, as it's slowing down, it's as though someone jumps in the cab, pulls the lever, and the train accelerates again out of the train station. For all sorts of reasons, I think you're right. In part, I think it's because there's a small group of activists who just will not give up. It's this constant sense of change. There's always the old establishment, the ancien regime, that needs to be weeded out of every corner of every organization. And that small number of activists who really believe in that are loud, and they are influential because they're loud and because they scare people, actually. And then there are enough people who go along with it, as it were, the sort of the useful idiots of a revolution, if you will, who just go along with it because it's too difficult not to. And so, I was just looking at going back to this particular organisation, the Royal College of Speech and Language Therapists. They came up in some of our research last year, before this event ever happened. We did a piece of research called the EDI tax, where we surveyed people across the country as to whether equity, diversity, inclusion was making people less racist or more racist, or how they felt about different issues. And it was having a censoring effect in that people were not saying what they did think, and they were saying what they didn't think. And then we added 2 appendices to that piece of work. So that piece of work is still up on our website. But the second appendix was about the Royal College of Speech and Language Therapists, and went through what was a new guide they had published, and that guide was called "Supporting LGBTQIA plus colleagues in the workplace: A Guide for All." And you could see very much not just the seeds of what's then happened to this chief executive, but very much the saplings. I would say that the garden was already growing up with this stuff. Just to quote a couple of things from their audit tool, uh, under Section 6, active development towards allyship, it says, I have attended LGBTQIA plus specific training, or I have some booked. I'm aware of all the national and the international days for the LGBTQIA plus community. And then in Section 5, or Section 1 rather, it says, I've undertaken allyship and active bystander training. I've taken LGBTQIA plus allyship, anti-racism, and disability affirming training. If white and not disabled, I understand and feel confident about my role in anti-racism and disability affirming work and support of LGBTQIA plus people of color and disabled people. It's like intersectionality bingo when you go through the lists of training courses that professionals, these are for professionals, this guide is for professionals, the list of training courses they're expected to go through, the list of days that they're expected to mark, the list of issues that they're expected to be on top of, and this active bystander training, that really does sort of, so that's very pernicious. It's that sense of, if you're not involved, if you're not actively calling it out, then you're part of the problem. Again, very slanted again towards one view of the world. So all of this was sort of, and still is, in fact, it's still out there. This training guide is still, as of, it says it the last time it was updated was February 2024. And so from that environment, and add to that group you mentioned a little earlier, Jan, you can see how the Mea Culpa apology was required of the chief executive just for following the wrong person, in inverted commas, on social media. The whole thing starts, you sort of have a Poirot moment. You kind of realize, yeah, this is obvious. This kind of thing was going to happen out of that backdrop, out of that background. And also, meanwhile, the poor clients of speech therapists, children across the country, are desperate. There's waiting lists for actual speech therapy. The thing that the organization is out there to do, people are desperate for that service. And also the professionals really want to provide that service. That's why they're in the profession. I think one of our members, we quote one of our members who contacted us about her concerns about that guide. And this is the quote: one would have thought the RCSLT would be better occupied with addressing the terrifying increase in children with communication problems and the soaring staff vacancies since lockdown. And she said, I've watched with dismay as the needs of those we are here to work with, predominantly children with communication needs, have taken second, third, and fourth place to the priorities of, as you said, Jan, a very small group of people who have extremely concerning priorities. So the whole thing just doesn't stack up, does it? Or it doesn't work for our society in the end of the day.
No, and every profession is being undone by this.
Yeah.
I think we saw it with our discussion that we had on about barristers. We've had it in medicine. the undoing of every profession. So some of the things I was looking into in this case of speech and language therapy, obviously a really, really important aspect of child development and support for parents. If children can't communicate, they're very difficult to deal with because they can be very angry and frustrated. So it's a really important thing that people have access to. And obviously we know that funding is short in all of these areas, and even by itself, that's an issue. But when if those who are teaching the professionals in these professions, like the lecturers at the universities, are primarily concerned with the politics, what they see as the politics, which is their view. It's not the only view. If they're concerned, I mean, some of the tweets, that the language that was used was of white women's tears in these Twitter feeds of the people that are leading this kind of really activist kind of charge. And this idea, one of the ideas is that there's no such thing as normal speech. So you think, well, if you're trying to help children to achieve something, you must have a sense of what you're trying to get them to. But they're saying, no, there's these really unhelpful norms of speech, which are infected by classism, racism, other kind of normative expectations. And like everything else, you can see that really destructive relativization. So people are just disoriented. What on earth are you trying to teach a child or help a child to develop if you don't think there is some kind of norm of speech? If you think that anything, anyway, there's so much to it. It's really a bit, but also it's very familiar and clearly breeds grievance. I mean, you can't, it kind of comes from grievance, and it just breeds grievance, and the grievance that can come from not being able to ask questions and to articulate your views.
And the
And that's
apology never seems to be the right way forward. I think Toby said this when setting up the Free Speech Union after his own cancellation experience. He said the last thing you do where there's grievance at heart in terms of the driver of the concern and the complaint, the last thing you do is apologize. And in fact, later in this Daily Mail article, in relation to the chief executive, um, everyone seems to have apologized, and all the initial responses, in brackets, fall short, or sorry, inverted commas, they fall short, and they result in further hurt, further anger, further disappointment. And the apology is really never enough, even when you make it as sort of Maoist and signing my own confession. You're almost expecting him then to be sort of led off to a fire pyre and set a light to it. It's like the Spanish Inquisition, which of course no one ever expects. But it's just go back into history, and you think, my goodness, this has happened again and again and again and again, and it's exactly the same sort of very basic instinct of humanity to hold people up in the stocks and throw vegetables at them, and I think that's what we're seeing here, really.
Yeah, it is. It really reminded me of an older case from 2021 of Ian Murray, who was the executive director of the Society of Editors, which is of newspaper and magazine editors. And when he defended the press against the accusations by Prince Harry and Meghan Markle that the UK press was institutionally racist, he said it's not, and defended his profession, as you might expect somebody to do. He was then removed. He had to apologize. Well, he did apologize, I think, against his better judgment. He didn't really want to, I don't think. But he was also then cast out as well, so he had to resign in the end. So the apology got him nowhere. And in the meanwhile, he's labelled a racist. I mean, just unbelievable. And really, people was very, very vicious the way people went for him. And there's so many of these examples.
Yeah, there's no forgiveness. There's no mercy. All of those things that we've talked about before. The elements of this reaction are always sort of very similar, very, very, very repeated in different situations. But you're right, the regulators are a new area that we've also talked about in the past. So it's not just the specific workplace you may be in, but if you're a professional, yes, say in the NHS, you'll be working and you can get into trouble by the policy in place in the NHS environment you're in. But then you'll also get in trouble from your regulator. You can also then get in trouble from your trade union, as we know. So it's all of these layers where the traps are laid to snatch you, to catch you. And that's a real theme, I think, that it's like, if you to sort of take a garden analogy, it's Japanese knotweed. You can't, I don't even know if that's the best plant to choose, but something that's so difficult to get out of your garden. And every time you think you've got rid of it, either by challenging an employer, you suddenly discover there's a regulator, or there's a trade union that's gone down the same route, another weed that's come up with this politicized view of the world that you are expected to adhere to, and you must apologize for not adhering to. It's bizarre, but unfortunately, it's very, very real. And we're seeing these layers crop up in our casework ever more. In fact, the more we win, the more we seem to see them pop up again. Now, did you want to mention a couple of events, Jan?
Yes, this is my parish announcements section. So, first of all, so we've got a farewell event with Graham Linehan, which I mentioned last week. That's next Monday, Monday the 20th in London. It's now sold out, so that sold out very, very quickly. I'm just reading Graham's book in preparation. I spent the very pleasurable weekend killing myself laughing and then annoying my husband by reading out passages from Graham's book, Tough Crowd. It's really, really funny, as
He's
well
a
as telling
very,
the story
very
of
funny
what
guy.
happened to him. Yeah, it's but he's got some brilliant stories. Anyway, but that's sold out in person. But Free Speech Union members can, as ever, join online free of charge. If you go to the link that was in last Friday's newsletter, and also I'll probably sending out an email this week with a link as well to join. You can just register to join on Zoom free. So do that. There's already nearly 300 people signed up to do that. So just take every opportunity to be part of what the Free Speech Union does, I would say. We've also sold out our Liverpool event, which is on the 22nd, so later that next week. That's where Toby's speaking. We're not quite sure yet if that's going to be streamed online, but if it's not live streamed, we will put a video up. It's definitely being filmed, so people can catch up with that. And that's starting slightly earlier than the original plan. So it's going to start at, I think, 7:30. We're now going to start it at 7. And we've got a reception between 6 and 7 for anybody who's got a ticket can come along and meet Toby for the first hour. And the reason for that is because we realised that the following day is our judicial review hearing back in London. So we've got to be back in London for 9 o'clock. So Toby's going to have to rush off straight after his speech in Liverpool. I'm going to be getting like a 5:30 train or something on the Thursday morning. So I won't be rushing off from our event. But it's like the logistics at the moment where there's so much going on. I suddenly realised that that it was not going to be possible for
To get you your
Toby to
own
both stay
train,
around. Yeah,
Jan,
well, that's
with
what I
Toby
wouldn't
and
mind
you to
that.
go
Yeah,
around the
like the
country.
Queen's train. I'd love that. Lovely
Like in
sheets
Dr.
and
Zhivago, where the train goes by.
absolutely. Samovar. I'll have a samovar, thank you. And then finally, in addition to our event in Manchester on the 1st of February, on the Saturday, that we already had Claire Fox and we already had Lindsay Smith. And now we've got Joey Barton joining the panel, who is very controversial, very outspoken, has always been. I mean, it's kind of interesting. I always was aware of him, but I've looked more into what he said over the years. Definitely a checkered past, I think it's safe to say, but interesting nonetheless. And obviously will be very interesting on the football question as a former professional player, as a manager, as a fan and a commentator. I think he's going to have a lot to say about that question, which is all about the kind of regulation of speech within football. And Toby's also going to be there and he's going to be chairing. So a real kind of walloping great panel we've got now. So do get those tickets because it will sell out. We've only got, I think, 130 tickets, 140 tickets. So go on our website on the events page and buy your tickets now because it will, I guarantee it will sell out.
That's brilliant. Well, we're
Yes,
not going to be able
that's
to
me.
keep Toby away from the football event, are we, Jan?
No, I know.
So there was no stopping him there.
No.
Brilliant. Thank you very much to everyone for listening, and thank you, Jan. And we will speak to everyone next week. Goodbye for now.
Great. Bye-bye. Thanks, Tom.